This afternoon, I would like to remind you to turn off your cell phones. After the presentation, we will have some time for the audience question and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you. Please ask one brief question. And now I would like to introduce you to Dr. Valentine.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for this, our third event in the Leavenworth series, A Military History of the Cold War. Today, Dr. Jonathan M. House speaks to you on the military crises of the Eisenhower era. Dr. House is the William A. Stofft Professor of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. He received his doctorate in European military history and his Army commission at the University of Michigan in 1975. After extensive service as an instructor and intelligence officer, Dr. House left active duty and became a tenured professor of history at Gordon College in Georgia. Recalled to active duty after September 11, 2001, he was promoted to colonel while serving as a Middle East analyst for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. House is the author of numerous books, most notably Combined Arms Warfare in the 20th Century, and with David Glantz, When Titans Clashed, How the Red Army Stopped Hitler. His latest book, A Military History of the Cold War, 1944 to 1962, will be published this fall. Please welcome my colleague, Dr. House.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah, I guess it is. Of course, that's always the, you always have to sort of edit your bio. Professor Wilson knows, for example, that one of my more dubious achievements is having taught David Petraeus when we were both captains. Obviously, he had a better career than I did, but we all sort of lived through that stuff. And no, that's not what we told the policymakers about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Let's not even go into that one, because that's a whole other story that I get blamed for that wasn't really our fault. But anyhow, what I wanted to do, though, this afternoon is talk briefly about a huge topic. Because when you look back at the Cold War, we're tempted to think of the Eisenhower administration as a period of relative calm between the Korean War on one hand, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, and all those other things on the other end. This is, of course, the period in which the United States and the Soviet Union really go into high gear about mass producing weapons of mass destruction and the delivery systems to get them there. That's the subject, actually, of the next talk in this series, I believe, next month. But what I want to talk about here is the international tensions, the more or less conventional, although they threaten to go nuclear, military confrontations of this period under Eisenhower. And I could talk, there are so many different ones. Some of you may even be veterans of some of them that we don't talk very much about. But in the interest of time, assuming this thing will go forward, and I guess it won't. Oh, that's nice. In the interest of time, let me just talk about a couple of instances. First is the two Taiwan Strait crises between Red China and the United States, and then the gradual involvement of the United States more and more into the Middle East. And really, it's under Eisenhower that we first get deeply involved in the Middle East, and not, as some people seem to think, only in the 1980s. But start, as I said, with China. The Truman administration had tried to sever its ties with the nationalist Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek, but a combination of domestic politics at home as well as the Chinese intervention in the Korean War made that impossible. And so the U.S. found itself forced to defend Chiang Kai-shek long after Mao Zedong had won the Chinese Civil War in 1945 to 49. From the start of the Korean conflict, then, the Washington is committed to preserving the nationalist Chinese government in exile, sometimes called the Kuomintang government, on the island of Taiwan, which at that time is really more commonly referred to by its Portuguese name of Formosa. Wish I could show you the map, but the machine has malfunctioned on us, of course. Let's see if I can get it to shut up here and not do this. Let's see. Maybe now it'll do it. Yeah. Don't you love it when computers try to think they're more smarter than you are? Yeah, there we go. Okay, and we think of Formosa as it is today as being the Republic of China, or whatever it is we're supposed to not call it because we recognize it but don't recognize it. But you have to recall, and some of you perhaps are more aware than am I even, that back in the 1950s, when the nationalists withdrew from the mainland in 1949, they didn't just hold on to Taiwan, they held on to a string of islands off the central and southern coast of China. Hainan, the largest one down there in the lower left corner, was taken by the Reds in 1950. Hong Kong, of course, belongs to the British. But the other islands there, Quemoy, Matsu, Yijiangshan, and the Dachan Islands, all were held by the nationalists. And in fact, to this day, there are a couple of other islands that are off this map to the east and south, a couple of unoccupied atolls, including, by the way, the nationalists still lay claim to part of the Spratly Islands, which is the middle of the oil crisis to this day. And it's these islands that really are the problem, because those islands are the ones that allow the nationalists to interfere with Red Chinese trade, to launch reconnaissance operations and indeed raids on the mainland. From as soon as Dwight Eisenhower came into office in 1953, he fulfilled a campaign promise that the right wing of the Republicans wanted him to do. They demanded that, and he did announce that the U.S. was going to, quote, unleash Chiang Kai-shek by having the 7th Fleet would no longer, quote, shield communist China from Formosa. Well, that's really the other way around, of course. The 7th Fleet since 1950 had been preventing the communists from invading Formosa rather than the other way around. So at this time, the only thing that this policy announcement made was the United States sort of adopted a handoff policy and allowed the nationalists to do a few more raids onto the mainland than they might otherwise have done. Eisenhower clearly hoped that such raids would sort of nudge Beijing away from the Soviet Union and make it more amenable to being an independent power and dealing with us separately. But of course, if you know anything about Mao Zedong, it just increased his irritation. From his point of view, the United States being involved with Taiwan is the same thing as the United States being involved in Korea. We're interfering in civil wars in which the communists should have won. And so for us to allow them to keep doing this is simply to make our diplomatic situation worse, if that were possible. Once the Korean armistice was signed in 1953, Beijing refocused its attention on those offshore islands. Obviously, Mao wanted to take the islands to finish his revolution, to finish taking over all of Chinese territory. But in addition to that, if you've ever looked anything at Mao, you know that he's always looking for opportunities to mobilize the younger Chinese, to put them under stress, if you will, to energize them with new crises. And in addition to that, he's very skillful at using Taiwan as a way to manipulate the Soviets into doing what he wants, much to their chagrin a number of times. In 1954, Beijing propaganda really cranked up, demanding recovery of the islands. On September 3rd of 1954, the People's Liberation Army, that is the Red Army, started shelling Quemoy. Now that again is another Portuguese name. I believe the Chinese name is Chinmin or Kinmin, but everybody always calls it Quemoy, so it'd be kind of foolish for me to try to actually give it its proper name. 6,000 artillery shells fell on Quemoy the first day, wounding, amongst others, 2 American military advisors. So we're in the middle of this from the very beginning. 2 days later, the U.S. Navy, back in the days when we had a huge Navy, had managed to muster up 3 carriers, a cruiser, and several dozen destroyers right off the coast of Quemoy, supposedly to prevent the communists from invading Quemoy, but there was really no indication, if you looked, that they were seriously planning to do an opposed amphibious invasion against the nationalist troops. It would have been a very complicated procedure, and there's no effort that they really wanted to do that. Now, if you go back to Washington and the National Security Council, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Arthur J. Radford, has just come from being the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, so he's very protective about Taiwan. And he argued in a number of meetings of the National Security Council that the nationalists could not hold Quemoy without American air and naval support. On the other hand, the Army Chief of Staff, General Matthew Ridgway, performing his soon-to-become traditional role of being the naysayer, said even that's not going to be enough. If you really want to hold that island, we're going to have to put a U.S. division onto the island of Quemoy. Now, obviously, both of those options are not politically acceptable. The United States has just finished one war in Korea. We have avoided getting involved with the French in Indochina just that spring. The last thing the Eisenhower administration wants to do is get involved in another land war in Asia, to quote the Princess Bride and other things like that. But in fact, of course, those of you familiar with this era know this is sort of the classic definition right there at the beginning, the classic debate, I should say, between those on the one hand who want to use high-tech and potentially nuclear weapons to do things, and those on the others who are talking about something that 10 years later or 8 years later we would have called flexible response. But it was there from the very start. The U.S., of course, had been worrying about Quemoy for some time because if you go back, I was talking in September 54, you go back to May of 54 and you find that the People's Liberation Army had already seized 4 tiny islands of the Dachshunds group all the way up in the northeast corner of this map, if you will. The Eisenhower administration, especially Secretary John Foster Dulles, feared a loss of face as well as territory if this kind of thing continued. And if this isn't enough, there's constant friction going back and forth. In July of 1954, a British airliner had gone missing out of Hong Kong. The U.S. Navy went looking for it, and off the island of Hainan down there in the south, 3 U.S. Navy fighters got jumped by 2 obsolescent red Chinese propeller fighters. Probably the last fight of propeller aircraft that I've ever heard of anywhere, unless you count P-51s in Honduras and places like that in the 60s, right? The U.S. Navy pilots, being much more experienced, just sort of shrugged their shoulders and shot down both Chinese, but that didn't do anything to calm down the tensions, as you can imagine. On November 1st, 1954, the communists launched a series of air attacks on the 2 northern island groups. They really weren't very effective. By their own account, they had trouble finding the islands and trouble dropping bombs because their pilots really weren't trained in that kind of operation. But they managed to distract the nationalists enough so that the People's Liberation Army could seize the island of Yijiangshan up there in the northeast, if you will, at about 3 o'clock on the map on January 18th, 1955. And who cares about Yijiangshan? Well, the point is that from that little island, then the Red Chinese could place artillery to shell the rest of the Dachshund Islands and really put them at risk. And I didn't put a scale on this map, but I should be fairly self-evident if you look at this, that those islands are far enough away that it's very difficult for the nationalist Chinese to fly air cover over them out of Taiwan. So they're really at a disadvantage in this whole operation. Diplomatically, the United States allowed Chiang Kai-shek to control the whole crisis. On December 2nd, 1954, Chiang obtained a mutual defense treaty with the United States. Although the treaty didn't specifically address the offshore islands, it really was talking about the island of Taiwan. Well, to cover that up, these are in the old days when Congress still believed in bipartisanship, I guess, Congress promptly passed by almost unanimous votes the so-called Formosa Resolution. And the Formosa Resolution authorized President Eisenhower to use American forces to defend not only the island of Taiwan, but, quote, such related positions and territories of that area as are now in friendly hands, and he judges to be required or appropriate, unquote. Every president loves to get authorizations like that from Congress, right? In any event, however, having made such a very strong diplomatic statement, the Eisenhower administration was wise enough to recognize that, as I said, the Dachshund Islands are indefensible, they're untenable. To obtain Chiang's agreement, though, to evacuate them, in January of 1955, Eisenhower secretly promised to help defend the remaining islands, Quemoy and Matsu, if they were ever attacked again. That's stretching the Formosa Resolution about as far as, maybe even farther than Congress intended to do this. Beginning on February 5th, 1955, the 7th Fleet assisted the nationalists in evacuating about 27,000 troops and civilians out of the Dachshund Islands south of Taiwan. And during this evacuation, the People's Liberation Army Air Force shot down a U.S. Navy Sky Raider, but fortunately the pilot was rescued, so you could sort of downplay the whole thing and not get too upset about it. But even this doesn't end the diplomatic crisis, even evacuating the islands. Secretary Dulles and other officials continued to make bellicose statements in March and April of 1955, hinting that Washington thought that Beijing was about to attack Formosa directly. Those of you who are familiar with John Foster Dulles know that he viewed the Cold War, and especially East Asia, in very absolute, moralistic, no-compromise terms. And so at a March 10th meeting of the National Security Council, Dulles asserted that the U.S. government needed to start preparing the American public to get U.S. involvement, including nuclear weapons, to defend these islands. And it's in that context, by the way, by this time, the Strategic Air Command has sent a wing of B-36 bombers to Guam with another wing on alert for deployment. You can never quite get a clear count of whether, in fact, they actually took the nuclear weapons with them or not. They finally declassified the nuclear annex to the war plan, but it really doesn't give you very much detail, so I can't tell you much about it. But it's in this context that Dulles then makes the famous policy statement that talks about massive retaliation, that if the United States feels that somebody has committed aggression, we will respond with clearly implied nuclear weapons. Although he was less sanguine about the use of such weapons, in late April, Eisenhower sent Admiral Radford and an Assistant Secretary of State to Taiwan with a further proposal. If Chiang Kai-shek would abandon the remaining islands of Quemoy and Matsu, then the United States would blockade the Chinese coast to make sure the Chinese never attacked Taiwan itself. Fortunately for regional security, Chiang turned him down. On April 23rd, the Red Chinese Foreign Minister, Zhou Enlai, discouraged by the fact the Soviets weren't backing them up very much on this one, and ended the confrontation by announcing that Beijing did not want war with the United States, at least not at this time. So the shelling gradually declined, but when the U.S. and the Chinese talked together in Geneva, they got nowhere, as you can imagine. Both Chinese had profited from this first Taiwan crisis. Beijing could claim that it had retaken territory in the teeth of American opposition. Taipei got a major defense treaty and other commitments for its future survival from the U.S. The end of the crisis did not mean, however, the end of friction and trouble. In fact, for probably a decade thereafter, the U.S. Navy had to maintain sea and air patrols in the very crowded Formosa Straits. In August of 1956, Chinese fighters shot down a Navy Mercator intelligence aircraft. Even when hostile forces were not involved, the grinding routine of standing patrols with undermanned ships, things we sort of tend to forget about when you look back about it, inevitably took its toll on naval forces. In 1 week, one of the carriers lost 3 aircraft by accidents while on patrol in this area. Meanwhile, from 1955 onward, both sides were improving their defenses while continuing to spar about the offshore islands. American military aid grew rapidly, including we gave the nationalists hundreds of landing craft. Ostensibly, the landing craft are so they can resupply these islands, but what else can you use landing craft for? To invade the continent again. The Republic of China, that is the nationalist Chinese armed forces, were already ludicrously strong since they only had the population basis of Taiwan to draw on now, but they continued to grow to a total of 600,000 men under arms. Still, the United States didn't believe that that was going to be enough. They didn't think that nationalists could defend themselves without U.S. support. In 1957, the United States announced that it was deploying to Taiwan nuclear-capable Matador missiles. Some of you may remember them. It's really sort of an evolution of the V-1 buzz bomb. It's sort of a primitive cruise missile, but you put a nuclear warhead on it, and I don't want to be on the receiving end, obviously. The next year, in a joint staff study completed in May of '58, the Joint Chiefs of Staff concluded the United States would have to use nuclear weapons if there was a war in this area. Beijing was equally diligent in preparing for future crises. In fact, they sort of set themselves up for the next crisis. They've spent a lot of time building airfields and doing all the humdrum things you need to improve your infrastructure in the area. And then in July of 1958, the communists began to reassign a lot of their pilots who were veterans of the Korean War south from Manchuria to the provinces opposite Taiwan. They built up a total of about 520 aircraft in one area. And amongst these aircraft are a significant number of MiG-17Fs. Again, some of you, I'm sure, are more familiar with that than I am. The MiG-17F was just about top of the line, even for the Soviet Union at this time. It had afterburners. It was a more stable and faster platform all the way around than the MiG-15s that were common in the Korean War itself. On the ground, there's 140,000 Red troops massed on the coast, as compared to 86,000 nationalist troops in Quemoy and 23,000 troops on Matsu. But now, listen to those numbers. I said them real fast, but if you listen carefully, there's almost as many nationalists as there are Red Chinese troops. That therefore doesn't sound like they're really serious about conducting an invasion, does it? They would have had to probably have 3 times as many troops there and a lot of help from the Soviets if they were actually going to invade the islands. So this is more or less sort of standoff gestures. And this leads us to the second Taiwanese crisis. In 1958, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, the United States gets involved in a prolonged crisis in Lebanon, and that distracts our efforts and our attention. So the Chinese leadership in Beijing apparently calculated that without directly fighting the United States, it could force the surrender of Quemoy and Matsu simply by shelling the place and cutting off supplies. Because the nationalists had no equivalent to the MiG-17s, the first time the Republic of Korea Air Force would had F-84s tangled with these MiG-17s, it caused alarm in both Washington and Taipei. So while the nationalists are getting trained up on new fighters, guess who's going to provide the air defense of Taiwan? The U.S. Air Force sent F-100 fighters. You can't get much closer to sort of getting in everybody's face than to put them out there like that. Neither this action nor the dispatch of a carrier battle group to the area reassured Chiang Kai-shek, however. And while these responses are developing on our side, and this is in August of 1958, a much publicized visit to Beijing happens by Nikita Khrushchev and his defense minister. Now, we always like to badmouth, and I'm particularly good at this, badmouthing CIA since I work for DIA, but in this case I have to tell you that CIA had it right. The analysts said no. The fact that these guys are coming to Beijing is a sign of that they disagree, that they don't like what the Chinese are doing, and they want to try to talk sense with them. But that's not the way it was interpreted by President Eisenhower, nor particularly, of course, by John Foster Dulles, who considered this visit a threat. In retrospect, it appears the Soviets had very little influence over Beijing's planning of the crisis. Khrushchev pretty much, he puts them on a spot. You know, how's he going to not support a fellow communist government when they say we're simply trying to reconquer our territory? So he ends up having to promise, well, if you need landing craft, I'll send them to you, things like that, and back down. Now, you see the situation we're into. The offshore islands are really not a vital American interest. And the Formosa resolution wasn't very clear about whether or not we were supposed to be committed to defending them, as Eisenhower had done. On the other hand, the fall of those islands might very well have caused such a demoralization amongst the nationalists that the whole nationalist regime would roll up, and that obviously was a loss of prestige that the U.S. didn't want to have. After waiting 3 weeks for the nationalists to decide, are they going to attack the mainland, are they going to withdraw, on August 23rd of 1958, China resumed its heavy bombardment of Quemoy. Before doing so, however, Mao, he still is very nervous about getting into a direct confrontation with the United States. And he summons the local commander of this siege, if you will, General Yifei, up to Beijing, and he wants him to promise that there won't be any significant American casualties. How's this poor general going to decide who happened to be standing up when the shells hit? You know, you can. I do not want to be in the Red Army at times like this. But generally, though, the communist plans seemed to be working. The nationalists were not able to resupply the islands under fire. On August 24th, communist PT boats sank one of the nationalist supply ships, damaged another. A couple of weeks later, when they tried to use a transport aircraft to parachute supplies, the MiG-17Fs very carefully suckered off the Republic of Korea fighters and shot down a couple of these transports. As in the previous crisis, Secretary Dulles took a hard line, although this time he left a little room for maneuver. With the backing of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President, on September 4th, he made a public statement indicating that the defense of Quemoy and Matsu was, quote, increasingly related to the defense of Taiwan. unquote, and that the U.S. would intervene if the nationalists were unable to defend the islands. Eisenhower himself, however, is more and more reluctant because he knows that his advisors are constantly pushing him and we're going to have to use nuclear weapons. And by this time in his presidency, he's 6 years in, he really does not want to get into that if he can help it. Meanwhile, however, U.S. military actions did have a practical effect on the crisis. U.S. cruisers and destroyers would escort the nationalists up to a point 3 miles away from the island because that would be territorial waters for the Chinese communists, and so they had to turn back there. The Chinese communists do not want to hit American ships, even by accident, and so that means that they can only fire at the resupply ships in the last 3 mile run in the period in which they're offloading the supplies. The U.S. also supplied 8-inch howitzers to put on the island so they could shoot back counter battery fire at the people who were shooting at them, which always helps your morale if nothing else. These measures, combined with a growing U.S. suspicion that maybe the Taipei government is exaggerating the whole thing, sort of reduced our sense of crisis in early September. The U.S. consistently opposed the nationalist plans, which is they wanted to conduct a major air raid on the mainland in retaliation. But as a precaution, the U.S. Air Force did, in fact, send a small number of B-47s, because by this time it's 1958, the B-52s have only just coming online, so the B-47s are the latest aircraft, and they get sent this time to Guam throughout the confrontation. By September 1958, the Lebanese crisis that I want to talk about next is winding down, so the U.S. Navy is able to assemble a force of 5 carriers in the Taiwan area. Meanwhile, the U.S. Air Force is able, for the same reason, to try and focus on it. The U.S. Air Force started to deploy its quick reaction forces. We're talking not about SAC nuclear bombers here, but fighter bombers and things like that, into the airfields in the area in Guam, in the Philippines, and things like that. And so they ended up, between the Navy and the Air Force, with 200 aircraft capable of carrying nuclear bombs concentrated off the coast of China. At the same time, the People's Liberation Artillery fire became intermittent, perhaps just because they were running out of shells after all this time. On September 6th, the Red Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai announced that he was prepared to resume ambassadorial discussions previously held in Geneva. Apparently, the Chinese had figured out that they really probably were not going to be able to starve the nationalists out of Quemoy. The next day, September 7th, Khrushchev weighs in with an extremely obnoxious, insulting, undiplomatic letter to Eisenhower, so undiplomatic that the American embassy sent it back to the foreign ministry, which accused the United States of having seized these islands from the people of China. I think Khrushchev, you'll never know for sure, of course, but I think Khrushchev here was simply, he wrote the letter to mollify the Chinese to appear to be supporting them, and he didn't really expect the U.S. to do anything about it, as you can imagine. Chinese and American representatives did meet in Warsaw later on in September, but they only restated their irreconcilable positions and got nowhere, as you can imagine. Then on October 6th, the People's Republic Minister of Defense, Peng Dehuai, the guy we never remember anymore, who in fact was the Chinese commander in Korea when they intervened in 1950, announced that out of consideration for the civilians on these islands, there would be a 7-day ceasefire. Well, that pretty much gives up any chance at all of starving the place out. In a bizarre touch, Beijing later announced that the People's Liberation Army would only shell the islands on odd-numbered days. So the U.S. Navy replied that they would only escort resupply ships on even-numbered days. President Eisenhower was right. He described this as a Gilbert and Sullivan war, but it continued intermittently for years, and there were occasional air battles involved. Both sides had been surprised by this crisis. Mao later admitted in speeches that he had been underestimated the American response. As for Eisenhower and Dulles, I think Richard Immerman has observed quite clearly that, quote, the speed and psychological pressures of a crisis situation brought both men dangerously close to shooting from the nuclear hip over stakes they knew that were nowhere near commensurate with that. 5 times in 1 year, President Eisenhower had to reject military advice to use nuclear weapons in the crisis. While Beijing and Washington maintained their prestige in the second crisis, Chiang Kai-shek sort of lost out. The U.S. had to pressure him into toning down his presence and his raids out of the islands. Nevertheless, as I'm sure you're all aware, 40 years later, those outposts in Taipei itself are still a bone of contention for the Beijing regime. And every time we sell even defensive weapons to Taiwan, the Red Chinese military breaks off whatever relationship we might have had with them at the time. Now, in the interest of time, let me give you a very, very brief, like about a 2-paragraph summary of the Suez Canal crisis. Those of you who are familiar with it know a lot more about it, but we are only involved in stopping it. We're not involved militarily. You need to understand it, though, in order to understand what follows. The charismatic Egyptian leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, had irritated Secretary Dulles and a lot of other Western leaders by trying to remain neutral in the East-West confrontation. He didn't see a whole bunch of difference between communists and former imperialists, frankly, which is an attitude that the Americans and the British couldn't understand. In July of 1956, therefore, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, took it over from its British and French operators in order to get the revenue from the canal so he could build a flood control dam on the Nile River. Dulles tried to deal with this problem by diplomacy, but the British and the French secretly decided they were going to retake the canal. They felt they needed to reassert themselves in this region. But their plan they came up with, let me just show you a map briefly if I can to see if you can get this idea. First of all, you can tell by the arrows that the British and the French are going to have to concentrate their forces in the western Mediterranean, sail eastward. The British at this time still hold Cyprus, which has good airfields, but it does not have good ports. And then from there, the original plan was the dotted lines. If you see down in the lower right-hand corner, they planned to invade Alexandria, one of the largest, most populous areas in Egypt, which inevitably would mean a lot of civilian casualties. March up the Nile River, conduct an opposed river crossing across the Nile River to the east bank, and then take Cairo. What they intended to do by this was obviously to force the overthrow or the collapse of Gamal Abdel Nasser. But the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, realized that this is not going to look very good. This is going to look like 19th century imperialism in the 20th century. And so he told the military to modify the plan. The plan they finally come up with is the solid black lines, which is that they, instead of going after Alexandria, they'll simply invade and seize the northern end of the Suez Canal around Port Said. The military, and by the way, at this time, particularly the First Sea Lord, tried to convince him that this was not going to accomplish what he wanted to. Okay, yeah, we'll retake the canal, but it's not going to overthrow President Nasser. If anything, it's going to reinforce President Nasser's support. This is very much, if you will, like where we stood in 1991. That we'd sort of had a disconnect. We forgot what the real intention was. The assumption was if you defeat Saddam, or read, if you defeat Nasser, he will be so embarrassed that he'll be overthrown. But they haven't really connected the dots. And when the military tried to tell Anthony Eden this, he basically said to shut up. He was tired of arguing with him about the whole thing. And if this isn't bad enough, then I have to go back to the sort of the facts of the matter. The British and the French come up with a cover story that they want to sell the world. And the cover story is they secretly made a deal with Israel, and Israel is supposed to invade the Sinai and attack the Egyptians. And then the British and French, pretending that they have nothing to do with Israel, would then announce that they would intervene to protect the canal. President Eisenhower, in his discussions about this, which he had photographs from U-2s showing them what they're doing, said, I see the hand of Winston Churchill, even though he's out of office in this, because it looks something from the Victorian age, that in fact it was pretty obvious. They said, you remember that map, if you got your ships combat loaded for an invasion and you sail a week before the Israelis attack, it's kind of hard to pretend that it was the Israelis' problem that caused the whole thing, as you can imagine. This complicated Israeli-British-French invasion began on October 29, 1956, but world opinion immediately condemned it. Eisenhower's outrage. I mean, notice what I said, October 29th, 1956. If you run back in your mind, those of you familiar with that era, this is the time period when the Soviets are putting down the uprising in Budapest, Hungary. And now the British and French are looking an awful lot like the same thing. Not only that, this is the week before President Eisenhower is up for re-election in the United States. So you can imagine he's just outraged that his supposed allies would try to pull this one on him and was not going to accept it at all. The U.S. refused to back the British financially because there was a run on the markets about this whole situation, and that forced the British to accept a ceasefire and United Nations peacekeepers. Nasser emerged as the hero of this whole crisis. British and French influence in the Middle East is fatally weakened. Now, this is all by way of background to what happens afterwards, because once the British and French are fatally weakened, you've got a power vacuum in the Middle East. And who's going to step in? The United States. Because we are afraid that, in fact, if we don't, guess who is going to do it? And indeed, Nasser, understandably irritated by the British and French attack on him, becomes a lot friendlier with the Soviets, who give him more weapons and more developmental loans. But anyhow, over the next 2 years, President Nasser continues to pursue his goal of pan-Arab nationalism, culminating in February 1958 with the creation of the United Arab Republic, a federated union with Syria and Egypt. At one time, very briefly, they had Iraq in as well, which is why the flags of all three look alike, except the number of stars in them even today, which we all tend to forget. Why do they all happen to look like this? Anyhow, these policies prompted Secretary Dulles and Eisenhower administration generally to agree with Britain that Nasserism, as they called it, was simply a stalking horse for increased communist influence in the Middle East. Now, the issue here is not the defense of Israel. Let me be clear about that. The United States is still holding Israel at arm's length. We will not sell Israel, I won't say any weapons, but almost any weapons. It is not even about oil, because in those days we still have fairly clear access, and if we don't have access, well, the SIS and the CIA seem to help make sure that we have access in Iran. Let's not go there, right? But, and so it's not about oil. It's really about containment. It's about a continuation of the worldwide struggle with communism, and the United States and the British are very concerned about this. So on January 5th, 1957, the President issued the so-called Eisenhower Doctrine, citing the traditional Russian desire to have control of the Middle East. He proposed both economic and military assistance to countries in the region, and he indicated that if we were invited, the United States would intervene to defend states against what he called pro-Soviet aggression. Now, the test case of all this was Lebanon. This former French mandate had been remarkably prosperous and stable, largely because it had a very complicated constitution that balanced off the three different religious groups in the country: Maronite, Christian, Sunni, and Shia Muslim. The Maronite president of Lebanon from 1952 to 1958 is President Camille Chamoun. You may see it translated other ways, but in that time it was translated this way because, remember, Lebanon had been a French mandate, and therefore they tended to write things the way it sounded like to a Frenchman for transliteration purposes. But in early 58, President Chamoun sought to Western support to change the Constitution in this regard. He wanted to succeed himself, and the excuse he gave was he's afraid of expanding pan-Arab influence, that perhaps Lebanon's going to be taken into the United Arab Republic. And there's a lot of agitation about that. There's radio broadcasts. There are mob attacks the U.S. Information Service Library in Beirut. Nasser's government kept up a barrage of anti-pan-Arab propaganda, and so Eisenhower was reluctantly willing to get involved to maintain order, but not to take sides. He certainly wasn't interested particularly in President Chamoun's problems. But events forced his hand. On July 14, 1958, a pan-Arab sympathizer, Brigadier General Abdul Karim al-Qasim, assassinated the king, the prime minister, the crown prince, and the prime minister of Iraq, which up to that time had been one of Britain's two remaining allies in the area. At one stroke, that pretty much wipes out most of the British defense plans for the region. Rumors of similar actions in Lebanon and Jordan spread, and so Chamoun is finally able to persuade the West that they have to intervene on his behalf. Eisenhower felt that he has to act to prevent further defections. The U.S. has a complicated plan, don't want to get lost in it today in the interest of time, called Blue Bat, which is basically to send a huge force into this region to defend Lebanon against a conventional invasion. But in reality, both the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Army in Germany are going through changes in organization at this time, which means they have neither the transport aircraft nor the riggers, the critical specialists who pack parachutes and pack your pallets to put them on the aircraft, to do this. And so it's absolute chaos when they realize they're going to have to execute it because they simply don't have the capability to do it. Moreover, the British tried to airlift a brigade of troops out of Cyprus to help the government of Jordan, but when they tried to fly over Israel without clearance, the Israeli Air Force turned them back. So the U.S. has to get involved. Eventually the British are allowed to go into Jordan, but the U.S. has to provide not only assistance to itself, but it has to provide air cover over the Brits in Jordan and things like this. Very complicated situation. On the evening of July 14th, though, President Eisenhower told his commanders that the next morning I'm going to announce this, so at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, I expect you to land troops in Lebanon. So they have about 15 hours to actually execute. By dint of great effort, and it was indeed sort of a masterpiece of improvisation, the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, sailed from Cyprus, landed at least its advanced elements near the Beirut airport south of the city at the prescribed time. Imagine these amphibious marine vessels lumbering out of the water, up onto the beaches, disgorging 4 companies of infantry fully loaded, and they don't encounter sniper fire or anything like that. They encounter bikini-clad sunbathers, children, and soft drink vendors. One Marine commented, "It's better than Korea, but what the bleep is it?" When the Marines and soldiers continued their hasty deployment, the U.S. Air Force had even bigger problems because they were based in the United States. And they had a plan to deploy a contingency force of 94 fighter bombers, reconnaissance, transport aircraft. But again, it's much longer distance than the Marines and the Army had to go, so they had, as you can imagine, problems. In particular, at the last minute, a couple of their squadrons were not able to go, so the Air Force turned to the 354th Tactical Fighter Wing in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And the 354th had been trained to deliver tactical nuclear weapons, not close air support. And they did not have training or equipment. You can imagine, if you will, flying a single-seat aircraft across the Atlantic without having done a lot of preparation for it. You can see what a hairy situation that would be. But nonetheless, you have to follow orders. The 354th launched. In the first squadron, 1 aircraft crashed, 7 landed en route with various maintenance problems, and only 4 reached Turkey on schedule. The expedition suffered a lot of problems like that. I don't want to go into them. Let me just tell you that another problem that we had is we were not able to explain our policy to the Arab world. We had 1 medium band radio on a ship anchored off Rhodes, but it didn't have enough wattage to compete with the other, the Arab capital radios that are thundering away about Western imperialism and intervention. And I mention this because there was a memo explaining all this to Eisenhower, which I found out in the Eisenhower library. And this, if you recall, is almost 50 years before we found ourselves in the same problem of not being able to explain ourselves to the Middle East when we go into Iraq and things like that, and yet nobody's ever solved the problem. At first, the massive flow of American forces overawed the local population. The commanders had little intelligence. One commander said he got more from talking to the wife of a former executive who used to live in Beirut than he did from all the intelligence reports he got. And because the United States is trying to stay neutral and not back President Chamoun, this puts a lot of stress, just as it is today. You have to have very tight discipline and great performance on the part of the troops, the Marines and the Army soldiers involved. On August 1st, a sniper killed an American sergeant in Beirut. Fortunately, this proved to be the only fatality of the entire operation. 3 weeks later, there's further firing incidents, a couple of wounded, both French and American, but that's about it. On July 23rd, however, the United States designated General Paul Adams as the commander-in-chief of land forces, that is, both Marine and Army, in Lebanon. Now, Paul Adams has a reputation of being a very demanding, uncompromising officer, but in this case, he was the right guy in the right place. He tried a number of different techniques. First of all, he basically told his troops to follow what we later would call gradual escalation. That is to say, if you're fired upon with a rifle, reply with a machine gun. If it's a machine gun, reply with a mortar. If it's a mortar, reply with an artillery piece until they stop. Just keep upping the ante. I don't know how the rules of engagement would go like that today. I don't know if it'd be acceptable to anybody. Then he, on August 23rd, a little bit more subtly, Adams invited a whole bunch of Lebanese army and police leaders to watch a training exercise in which the U.S. Army destroys a simulated roadblock in short order. And the Lebanese got the message and passed the message to the resistance, and so the violence declined temporarily. Later on, when a tank battalion arrived by sea from Germany, and they had piles and piles of supplies built up because they thought they were going to fight a war, General Adams had tank platoons just sort of wandering around the streets of Beirut, and periodically they would stop, orient their gun tubes toward the Mediterranean, and just let fly, fire main gun rounds into the water. He called this, as you can imagine, a show of force with psychological overtones. With the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army, fortunately I'm going to try to cut this as short as I can, in control of Beirut, American diplomacy can finally try to get a more permanent solution. And the man who has to do this is on the center there, Ambassador Robert Murphy. Those of you familiar with World War II know that this is the legendary American diplomat in French Northwest Africa. Big surprise that President Eisenhower should call on the same guy who had helped him in the Torch invasion. And Murphy does a very good job of convincing the different factions in Lebanon, you've got to resolve the presidential succession crisis so you can get the Americans out of here. Eventually, the Lebanese parliament elected General Shahab, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, as the president. And on October 8th, the Eisenhower administration announced that all U.S. forces would withdraw from Lebanon. On the last day, when most of the American forces had withdrawn, General Adams got in his limousine with 2 American flags on the front and drove right through the middle of Beirut. And instead of being shot at, he got just scattered applause from the population. Operation Blue Bat gave all the appearances of a success, and Lebanon remained quiet for another decade. But no limited deployment of American troops could resolve the fundamental instabilities of complicated situations in the Middle East. So the 1958 intervention, our first in modern times, unless you count 7 Marines in Libya, right, gave American policymakers sort of a false sense of their ability to control things. And it sort of covered over the huge blank check that the Eisenhower administration had written if anybody else ever asked for help. For that matter, and I want to conclude on this, all of these crises, I think, illustrate that the new look and massive retaliation had visible problems with them, even under the Eisenhower administration, long before the advent of flexible response. And let me stop there because I don't want to run too far over here. Leave time for questions.
There's an article that appeared in the latest issue of New York Review of Books by Thomas Powers, which gives a general review of presidents since World War II and gives very high marks to President Eisenhower. I don't know if you're familiar with that article or not.
I haven't seen the article, and I'll defer to the diplomatic historian here, but I think that that's true, that more and more as we look back at it, the revisionist version is that Eisenhower really knew what he was doing. His relations with his own military commanders were not very good, but as far as his foreign policy, I think it was pretty effective.
What would you say would be the guiding principle or overarching principle of President Eisenhower's foreign policy?
President Eisenhower's foreign policy, although he probably would disagree with this, comes very close to NSC 68, which is expressed under Truman, that is to say, in 1950, National Security Council Document 68. That is to say, on the one hand, we want to contain the Soviets, but on the other hand, we want to do it in a way that maintains the long-term economic health of the United States. And that's why he's trying to find a way not to maintain large conventional armed forces. But I've just shown you the limitations of that when you don't have large conventional armed forces, you get yourself in all kinds of problems. You really have no choice but to go all the way to the nukes, right?
John, just two quick questions. One, first, you zip past the Indo-Chinese crisis. And the question, I guess, is, was there a lesson learned there? That is, the debate about the decision not to use the nuclear weapons, not to intervene, so to speak, as it applied to the Taiwan issue. And the second question is, are you going to, is John going to talk about this whole issue of liberation and how it connects to?
I don't believe so, no. I think he wants to focus on the real massive
Okay,
retaliation.
well, I wondered whether, was there, you know, I grew up as a little stamp collector as a kid, and there were all those stamps about how we were committed to the liberation of Eastern Europe. I wonder, was there an army contingency or a military contingency plan to actually support that?
The only military contingency plan, of course, as you know, was the Special Forces. 10th Special Forces Group at that time was filled with refugees from Eastern Europe who spoke the languages and were spending all their time planning to jump out of perfectly good aircraft and try to organize the resistance in case of a general war. But I mentioned also, as you're well aware, when push comes to shove in the Budapest crisis, we had been urging people on Radio Free Europe and places like that to do things, but in fact, we didn't actually do anything. There really wasn't anything you could do realistically. Yeah. Drop pamphlets and accept a large number of refugees, and including some who, at least one who became a general in the U.S. Army. But we couldn't, it really wasn't practical, as you say, for us to get involved in that stuff. To come back to your first question, Indochina, I mean, there's a lot of different accounts for this. I would refer to those, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, there is actually a study, it's called, if I remember right, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Indo-Chinese crisis, which describes the relationship between the U.S. military and the French throughout this period. And that's, to me, that's a lot more measured than some of the more extreme things like Operation Vulture that talks about the contingency plans to use nukes. And I think that if there was a lesson learned there, it actually had been learned in Korea. But one of the things that people had decided was that it's nice to say tactical nuclear weapons, but at least in Asia, where are you going to find a target that justifies dropping a 20-kiloton bomb on? There really isn't anything that would be decisive that you could use small, quote unquote, as an oxymoron, nuclear weapons in a tactical role. And I think that's one of the principal reasons why, even though they talked about doing it, the local Air Force commander even went and reconned by air around Dien Bien Phu. Ultimately decided it really wouldn't prove anything. It probably caused as many friendly casualties as enemy. Sir.
During the Cold War, did the United States Central Intelligence Agency consistently overestimate the strength of the Soviet military?
This is a common problem, and probably the answer is yes. And let me tell you that why, sort of. I actually was in the room in 1990 when Central Intelligence Agency and Defense Intelligence Agency guys got together and said, look, when it comes to the Iraqi army, we have to assume that every unit is at full strength and that all their vehicles and tanks work. We know that's not true, but if we do anything else, we would be underestimating them, and that could be more dangerous. And I think that's probably what we had been doing for 50 years. We had been assuming that the Soviet army was fully effective, even though people knew that. I mean, when I was taught, you can believe the Army taught me to read aerial photographs with these Coke bottles, but when I was taught to read aerial photographs, they used to show us the East German motor pools. And our instructor said, look, you see this nice, neat motor pool? That's an East German motor pool. You see this messy one? That's a Soviet motor pool. That they can't even keep their troops to keep their stuff cleaned up and organized because they have such rapid turnover and so on and so forth. And so you're right. I mean, your basic question, yes, we did overestimate. But I would submit to you that to do otherwise would be just as dangerous, maybe even more dangerous, to assume that they couldn't do something that maybe they could have, right?
I've long wondered how we were loaded up from a tactical point of view with A bombs versus H bombs, and when it occurred. Were the bombs that we were, not that it mattered, I suppose, when whether it's an A or an H that goes off, but were our bombs at the time through the 50s, did they just start out building H-bombs and never really built the A-bombs for use on board planes, or did we?
I think, some of it we may never know, but the short answer, I think, is we continued to make atomic bombs, as I said, for the supposed tactical use. And the same thing was true of the Soviets. The Soviets ran a war game in, I think, 1961, where they planned to use something like 160 small nuclear weapons in the first 24 hours of the war. But the hydrogen bombs were, of course, as you say, more for the strategic missions. That if you're going out to obliterate a missile field or an industrial town, then that's where you need this. But a hydrogen bomb, most of them that we troubled to build, had such huge capacity that they would have been almost wasted if you try to use it tactically. You would have ended up, dropped one and you obliterate an entire province of East Germany or something. And I think that's probably the distinction.
Do we know when the H-bombs became manageable to be carrying on a plane? Was it like 53, 54?
Well, as you know, that we did our tests, and they're followed almost immediately by the Soviets. And our first actual test drops are in, I think, 53, 54. I have to go check my dates. 54, yeah. But I can tell by your question that you know that having the capability to detonate something is not the same thing as having a reliable, deliverable weapon. So I think it's probably more like 57, 58. And the other thing to remember about all this, of course, is that when we talk about these bombers, even the early models of the B-52 bomber, are built with tube technology because the transistor is so new. And imagine how unreliable tube technology would be, vacuum tubes I'm talking about. Some of you here are old enough, so other people say, huh, what's that? But I mean, literally, you can imagine how hard it would be to build something that could stand the strain of combat flights. And so you have to wonder just how effective they would have been if they'd actually had to do it as far as navigation and so on and so forth, and communications.
You know how many atomic cannon were produced?
Good question. You're talking about the, 280 millimeter? Relatively more than we thought. In fact, at one time, we actually put a battalion of those into Taiwan as well. And the last combat troops we kept in Japan was a battalion of atomic anti. But I think the peak in Germany where there were 6 battalions, but a battalion I think was only 4 of them. So probably all told there might have been 40 produced. I don't know exactly. Relatively limited number because they're very hard to move around, as you can imagine. It's mostly the U.S. Army wanted to have an all-weather capability.
And there's still one out at Fort Riley.
Oh, yeah, sure. They're huge monster. Takes 2 tractors. Those of you not familiar with it, has a huge tractor at each end to move it because it's so big and heavy. And then its range is, 18 kilometers, something like that. That was one of the problems you had with tactical nuclear weapons. Is later on we developed Honest John and Little John rockets, so you could give each lieutenant colonel, each battalion commander of 600, 700 guys, could have his own hip pocket nuclear weapon if he wanted to. The problem was that the blast was almost as far as the range of the missile. The joke was we could build an atomic hand grenade, but who was going to throw it?
In Nevada.
Yeah.
And I think there were around 80 of them, and right now there are only 3 of them left alive.
I can imagine.
Because of the radiation,
Yeah.
things like that.
And that was one of the big debates, as you know. Yeah.
And of course, the Canadians didn't want to pay, didn't even say they weren't even there until somebody did some research, and they got $20,000. And the Americans, soldiers who were out there in those trenches, got 80,000.
Sometimes somebody calculated that as many as 500,000 American troops were exposed to nuclear weapons like that for 2 purposes. One, this is really cynical to say, but we had to have the data for what does radiation do to you. But also they were trying to get the troops used psychologically. What happens when you see a nuclear weapon detonate within sight of you? And then we ask you to, oh, by the way, now we want you to attack towards it. Now that takes a really high degree of courage in my book. Okay.
John, you know that there was a lag terms of making that connection.
Mhm.
Because I remember seeing some of the materials from the curriculum in 1955, 56, which basically said, if you're in a tank, close down the tank and go fast, and you'll get through the.
Yeah. Well, you would get through the radiation. The tanks actually, I forget the transmission factor, but a tank, if it's buttoned up, will cut out about 96% of the radiation. But obviously, you can't drive through the blast. We're only talking about going through the radiation afterwards, the residual radiation. Yeah, but all the things we used to have to remember how to calculate, right? Some of you are old enough to know. We all got taught how to calculate how much your troops have been exposed to this stuff. When I taught here before, at the time when you were there, the tagline was 30 days, half September, and the man with 600 rads, I think it was. In other words, that was a lethal dose. Okay.
To what extent did the United States do aerial surveillance of the Soviet Union? We all heard about Gary Powers being shot down, but how prevalent was that?
As you perhaps know, that's really Gary Powers is the last one, as far as I know. That there had been, first of all, a number of operations on the perimeter. Some of the SAC had actually flown over the pole. I think they were operating out of Thule, in fact, and they would deliberately try to see how far they could penetrate into Soviet air defense. One of them got, I forget, let's say 100 kilometers into Siberia because they were trying to see how many Soviet aircraft were actually on a particular airfield at the time. A couple of them got shot down in the process, as perhaps you're aware. There's a lot of signals intelligence collection on the periphery. But it's not just us. The British were flying photographic Spitfires out of Hong Kong. And the nationalist Chinese, to come back to what I was talking about, were flying U-2s that we gave them over China. And in fact, the first U-2 shot down by an SA-2 missile was shot down over Red China, but we didn't know what happened. And that was a year before Francis Gary Powers got shot down, so we should have known. But there's also, of course, the Project Genetrix, I think it is. They launched hundreds of balloons, high-altitude balloons from Europe to drift over the Soviet Union and take pictures to get a baseline of the whole Soviet Union. And then they were supposed to, at a certain point, the timer would release the capsule when they would end up in the Sea of Japan or someplace like that, only sometimes the timers went wrong and the Soviets captured them and found out what they were doing in protest. And President Eisenhower, every time they protested, he would stop whatever we were doing for a while. But he didn't really understand how, and those who are familiar with 1941 know that the Germans had flown a lot of high-altitude reconnaissance missions over the Soviet Union, and so this just aggravated the whatever out of Khrushchev, that we would do this. To him, this was just the next step to war. And he was very, very upset about it, and we didn't really understand that until Francis Gary Powers got shot down. Of course, the day that Powers was convicted and sentenced was the first day that we had a satellite imagery collected, so we didn't need to do that anymore. Yeah, I think we need to cut it off. We've pretty much been here just about an hour, right? So it's time to quit. Thank you for your time, folks.